Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program with the Commonwealth Club, coming to you virtually whenever you're seeing this. I'm Clara Jeffrey, editor of Mother Jones. This program is part of the Commonwealth Club's virtual series addressing the impacts of COVID-19 on our community and society at large. We'd like to thank the members, donors, and supporters for making today's program possible. It's so important to support media and programs like this right now. We hope others will follow the example of those who have supported and help the club make it through these uncertain times. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Congressman Adam Schiff, Chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Schiff, you are all aware, gained national recognition and prominence for his role in the Russia and Ukraine investigations and President Trump's subsequent impeachment. In the last few weeks, Congressman Schiff and some of his colleagues have proposed a 9/11 style bipartisan commission to investigate the government's response to COVID and to determine if it ignored key warning signs and to help oversee how the trillions of dollars that are being allocated for stimulus are in fact being spent. If you're watching online and have a question for Congressman Schiff, please put the comments in the comments field in Facebook if that's how you're seeing us, or in text chat if you're on YouTube. Thank you, Congressman Schiff, for joining us today. First, how are you, your family, and your district doing?
We're doing okay. The family, knock on wood, we're healthy. I keep an eye on, from a distance, my 92-year-old father to make sure he stays out of trouble and is doing his social distancing. But we're healthy. In terms of the folks within my district, like everywhere else, are really struggling, desperately concerned about their health and the health of their families, the health of our economy and their businesses. I've had people describe how they put everything they could into building a wonderful business and now are at risk seeing it go away and for good. They've struggled through this small business program to try to access funds. Others are struggling just to keep a roof over their head. So it's an enormously challenging time. Nonetheless, I think there's a great willingness to endure the hardship, recognition that what we do right now will determine just how long this virus is with us and how much suffering and death accompany the virus. So I think my constituents are being very responsible in staying home and being socially distant, and the healthcare workers in my district, like everywhere, are just doing heroic service right now. And I'm in awe of what they're doing, and so grateful to people working in grocery stores, delivering the mail, packages, everything. We're very lucky for a lot of courageous people right now.
Congressman, at the end of the impeachment trial, you posed a rhetorical question to the Senate. And you said you may be wondering how much damage the president can do over the next few months before re-election. And then you said a lot of damage. And I'm wondering what you were imagining then, in what kinds of damage could be done and how that squares with what's happening right now.
Well, I have to say those comments really haunt me at this point. I don't think, even though I certainly could imagine, and we had good reasons to do so, all kinds of ills that the president would commit in the next 9 months in office. I don't think anyone anticipated that we would very soon lose more lives than we did during the Vietnam War, and in significant part due to the incompetence and maladministration of this president. So I think we grossly underestimated, frankly, the damage that he could do over the next 9 months. I did certainly contemplate this is a president that could either deliberately get us into a war or bungle his way into a war. That was probably a greater concern. Then there was the daily damage he was doing to our country by sowing division with the country, with animosities among our people. But I don't think I could have expected in my worst nightmare that we would have a crisis so large and handled so poorly at such a dramatic cost to the country.
The impeachment proceedings and then trial centered around the accusation that President Trump essentially extorted the president of Ukraine and then covered it up. How have we seen the "I would like you to do us a favor now" mentality of the president play out in this crisis?
Well, probably the most direct and pernicious echo that we hear of what the president was saying and doing during the course of his Ukraine misconduct, when he was essentially telling the leader of another country, look, you need to announce these investigations of the Bidens, and was withholding military aid from that country, a country at war with our adversary, until he could get those announcements. Now, those announcements of those investigations into the Bidens were something that he wanted to trumpet on the campaign trail. And so flash forward to today, you have the specter of the president at the White House basically saying, I don't want to call back governors. I don't want my vice president to call back governors who are not saying nice things about me. And of course, those that have been willing to say nice things about him, and of course, the governors are in a terrible position. We have seen the Trump campaign take those statements by governors and put them into campaign ads. So in very much the same way, he has made it clear that states that play ball with him, that are willing to be nice and say nice things that he can use in campaign commercials, well, he's going to take one view of, and the others will take a very different view of. Now, is this why we're seeing, for example, Florida, which has a Republican governor, key swing state, get everything it asks for in terms of ventilators or protective gear, while other states like New York, California, and elsewhere, Michigan, have to really struggle? The answer is we simply don't know, and we can't have any confidence that this president or his administration are making those decisions on the basis of science, on the basis of need, on the basis of what's in the best interest of the American people. But as we said during the trial, the one thing you can always count on Donald Trump for is he will do what's right for Donald Trump, not what's right for the country. And I think we see that not just in the potential manipulation of aid, but in the ability of the administration to reward friends and punish enemies in corporate America, in the way aid is being doled out. We have a serious question, for example, about whether California, which ranks second to last in access to the small business funding, at least in the first tranche of funds, is being penalized because it's a blue state, whereas red states are going to be rewarded. That has been the pattern of this administration, and it wouldn't surprise any of us if that was the pattern even during a pandemic.
He also made threatening remarks yesterday about what could happen to states that have sanctuary cities in terms of funding. Can you elaborate a little bit on what he said?
Yes, and basically that the suggestion, the threat that was implied was that relief funds, COVID relief funds, were not going to go out, or not in as great an amount, or under certain circumstances, unless these states agreed to abandon their sanctuary cities policies. So basically, he was going to force these states to abandon looking after the most vulnerable citizens, immigrants and undocumented citizens, if they wanted to have full access to health services, funding for protective gear, et cetera, or relief funds. Now, this was not an isolated act, either in its sort of treacherous content, this I want you to do me a favor, though, kind of aspect, but it also followed on the heels of the president announcing that he was going to end immigration into the country. And, this is also very consistent with the president and the Trump administration, which is when they need to deflect public attention away from their mishandling, in this case, their deadly mishandling of the pandemic, when they need to rile up their base, when they're losing support even among their base, they need to go back to their xenophobic red meat and attacking immigrants, both in the changes they want to make to immigration policy now, but also this threat to states with sanctuary cities, are both of the like kind, that is extorting or attacking the most vulnerable states and populations in order to placate the base and further divide the country.
You said a minute ago that it's always hard to tell if something is of corrupt intent or just incompetence. And it feels like this is particularly true at this moment. Do you Are you able to untangle those things? I'm particularly struck by the fact that, in a way, President Trump would do himself the biggest favor politically had he handled this early and well and generously and mourn the dead and do the usual things that presidents of either party do when there's a catastrophe that hits a nation. Um, so he's getting in his own way, it would seem, politically.
Yes, well, this has been the story of the Trump presidency, though, and that is you can look at things objectively and say that's really not in the president's interest to do politically. But he does it nonetheless because he thinks it's good for him personally. Now, he also thinks it's good for him politically. But it's part of the myopia of this extraordinary narcissism we see in this president that it always has to be about him. And so, right now, for example, these daily press conferences, they're not in the national interest. It's certainly not in the national interest for Donald Trump to be out there postulating that maybe people should inject bleach as a way of killing the virus, or suggesting new treatments, or pushing out untested treatments. That is not, at least in the least bit, in the national interest. It's not in his political interest either. And only recently did it occur to him, okay, maybe he is overstaying his welcome on people's TV screens. Maybe this is starting to do him damage. But the entire prism is not what's best for the country with this president. The entire prism is what's best for him. And I suspect even if these continued press conferences hurt him, he will continue to do it because personally, that's what he wants to do. He cannot turn down something that generates ratings. He cannot have the conversation in the nation be about something other than him. And so I will be astonished if we see a profound departure from what he's doing, even as much as it's not in the country's interest. And I think, viewed objectively, it's not in his interest either.
Do you think that's in part because his aides and his children are unable or unwilling to actually tell him the truth, or are they living in a bubble of their own creation as well?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. One of the other points we made during the trial is that you're not going to change the president's character, or more accurately, lack of character. You're not going to be able to constrain him. He is who he is, and so nothing is going to change about this president's conduct. For as long as he's in office, he is going to be as destructive and I think perniciously self-centered as he is. That's just not going to change. Now, in terms of his family members, I think Jared Kushner was asked within the last 24 hours about this grim milestone we are crossing, where more people are dying of the virus and have died of the virus than died during Vietnam. And his answer was, we've made really good decisions. We're doing a really good job. He made a comment in his last press conference at the White House, which was equally revealing in terms of this whole family's blind spot. When he made the observation in trying to criticize governors in various states that, well, this just shows why it's important for voters to think about competence when they're voting to elect someone. It's a bit like when Don Jr. Tries to attack the Bidens for using the Biden family name. There is just this lack of self-awareness of this family, which takes your breath away. But in any event, they can't control him. They're not going to control him. He is who he is. The damage goes on. And I think the most that we can do in Congress is try to mitigate and limit the damage, try to do vigorous oversight, try to insist on accountability. We need to do that in real time, but it will also be very important in terms of the commission you mentioned at the outset, that when this is behind us, that we have a truly objective, nonpartisan, whole of government review of what went wrong, how to protect the country better in the future, in the same way we did after 9/11.
I want to come back to the commission in a minute, but I just want to stay on this or something that you just said reminded me that the president's come out in the last few days reporting in various newspapers that the president's daily briefings and other forums in which he receives intelligence information did mention the threat of COVID, early to mid-January, and kept persisting in being included in those briefings. Now, I know he doesn't read them all, and sometimes he doesn't even attend a digest of them. But from your perspective, because you too were busy with impeachment at that time, and yet on the Intelligence Committee, was Congress aware of the risk that this posed?
Well, Congress was doing a number of things before this pandemic to prepare for a potential pandemic, just as indeed the last administration was doing. And I think part of the reason we're in the situation we are now is that Donald Trump disbanded the pandemic response unit in the White House and the National Security Council that serves as a tripwire for just this kind of danger to the country. In the Intelligence Committee, for the last 3 years, we have been including in our Intelligence Authorization Act, our yearly work product, a provision requiring the intelligence community to report to us on its posture in dealing with this threat, how it's resourced to deal with this threat, what more needs to be done to deal with this threat. Now, that bill we would get passed in the House, frankly, on a bipartisan basis, but the Senate, because of its dysfunction, could never get an intel bill passed until last year. So late last year, that provision finally became law. It wasn't for lack of trying in terms of our committee, but it became law too late to really help Congress assess how the intelligence community was postured for this pandemic. But nonetheless, we did get briefings from the intelligence community. We did hold a hearing on it. I think we held a hearing on it the very day verdicts were coming back in the trial. Or we had actually a house-wide hearing that day, and we had a committee hearing within a week of that. So we were getting briefed. Now, I think it's too early to say whether the community did a good job or a poor job in terms of its analysis and reporting on what it was seeing in China. We are doing a deep dive on that issue right now. We are going through all of our holdings. What did they brief us in person? What did they brief us in writing? What were they seeing? Were there conflicting inputs? We don't know yet what the administration was being briefed, what the president was seeing in his daily briefs. But we can at this point look at what we were receiving. And part of what our focus is determining, okay, what did we see? When did we see it? Was the intelligence community well integrated with the health community, the CDC, NIH, for example? That's not something that is ordinarily viewed as central to an intelligence community responsibility. So we're asking the big questions about whether there needs to be a refocusing, a restructuring against these giant threats that, frankly, I think loomed lesser on the landscape than, for example, terrorism or the threat posed by nation state actors like Iran. And one of the things that we want to come out of our committee and we would like to see come out of this commission report is an analysis of our whole of government posture vis-a-vis this threat, what needs to be done to better protect the country in the future. So those are all the things that we're studying now.
Do you feel confident that you are getting forthright briefings from the intelligence community, given that President Trump retaliated against those who felt compelled, or in some cases were compelled to appear before your committee and Congress as a whole?
Well, it grieves me to say that the answer is no, that there has been a tremendous politicization of the intelligence community under Donald Trump. It has really reached its pinnacle with the appointment of Rick Grenell as the top intel official in the country, someone who has virtually no intelligence experience. He was essentially a Twitter troll before he became an ambassador in the Trump administration. He did what you do to get a high appointment in the Trump administration. You go on Fox, you go on social media, and you make the most incendiary attacks on the president's opponents and say the most exaggerated claims of greatness on behalf of the president, and that gets you appointed. And he's been, in the way incompetence often rises to the very top, able to rise to the top of the intelligence community now. And we've seen, I think, a very dramatic change in the quality of what we can count on in terms of reporting on issues like election interference. What are foreign powers like Russia doing to try to interfere in the next election? The pandemic issue, frankly, looms now far larger. Can we count on an intel community led by someone whose only qualification is being a loyal partisan of the president to be revealing the full analysis of the intelligence community on this threat, and when it identified it and how it identified it and how it made Congress and the administration aware of it? I just don't have great confidence, sadly. But we're going to do the very best oversight that we can. We're going to use the levers that we have, including our budgetary power, to insist on answers. And at the end of the day, much as with Ukraine, we will find out the truth. But the firing of the last Director McGuire, the firing of the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, the firing of heads of the National Counterterrorism Center, the replacement of some of these people, the threats against other inspectors general, all of this is designed to have a chilling effect on what the intelligence community is willing to say to the Congress, is willing to say into the public in open hearings. And that's really a grave danger to the country.
I think it came as a surprise to most people that inspectors general, who are supposed to be this firewall against intergovernmental corruption or malfeasance of other sorts, could be so easily dismissed by the very people that they are reporting on. Is that something that happened before? Are there remnants of this in the Nixon era or other eras? And what could Congress do, presuming there's a change in leadership in the Senate, to fortify those rules and laws?
It's a really good question. And, first of all, the Inspector General system, which has been really integral to rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in government, and is a great success record, is a post-Watergate reform. That's a system that was set up in the wake of Watergate to try to make sure that there were independent watchdogs. But like so many of the post-Watergate reforms, they've been obliterated by this president. The independence of the Justice Department, for example, from White House interference in particular cases, was a post-Watergate norm that has been now completely obliterated. When you see the president weighing in on the sentencing of Roger Stone, for example, you see the Attorney General of the United States doing the president's handiwork in the dark by intervening either in the case of Mike Flynn or Roger Stone, or establishing effectively political investigations, potentially even political prosecutions, as you see with the Attorney General's discrediting statements against his own Inspector General of the Justice Department that found that the Russia investigation was properly begun, it was properly predicated. And yes, there were problems with the Carter Page FISA application, but the investigation itself was properly initiated and had nothing to do with Christopher Steele's dossier. The Attorney General attacking his own Inspector General shows a profound breakdown in that set of post-Watergate norms and reforms. In the intelligence bill that we're drafting now, we are going to have a provision that provides that you cannot fire an Inspector General except for good cause. We're going to also have requirements that if you do fire an Inspector General, Congress needs to be informed of what they were working on when they were fired. We are trying to find out from the Office of the Director right now, what was Michael Atkinson working on when he was fired by the president? The law says that when you fire an Inspector General, this is existing law, you have to give 30 days notice to the Congress. Well, the president did an end run around that by firing the Inspector General, and in that 30-day period, putting that Inspector General on immediate administrative leave so that they couldn't fulfill that last 30 days. Now, that 30 days might have given the opportunity for the Inspector General to make sure that investigations that were ongoing were not precipitously closed or swept under the rug or made to disappear. So we are going to be putting in statute protections for the Inspector Generals going forward, things that we didn't think were going to be necessary because we thought presidents would never do what this president is doing. Indeed, we're working in our committee with other committees on a whole package of what we are calling our own post-Watergate reforms, things that will be necessary when this president is gone to make sure that our democratic norms and institutions are codified, our protections are codified, so that they can never be assaulted the way that this president has.
And have you found any bipartisan support for such line of thinking thus far?
You know, I have always felt, and I've been saying this for the last couple of years as we've been working on these post-Watergate reforms, that given the slave-like devotion of particularly House Republicans, Kevin McCarthy doesn't cross the street without asking Donald Trump. That kind of sycophantic, slavish devotion to the president isn't going to admit of independent reforms. Any kind of safeguards like we're talking about would be viewed as an implicit criticism of the president, and they simply lack the courage to do it. However, when this president is gone, I fully expect there will be bipartisan support for these reforms because the Republicans, like the Democrats, recognize just what kind of catastrophic damage this president is doing. They just don't have the courage to say or do anything about it while he has such a grip on the base of the Republican Party. But I think that will change. And one encouraging sign on the idea of a 9/11 commission. I've introduced a bill to accomplish that. Republicans in the House have also introduced legislation to establish a commission, very much like what my bill would do. And so I think it's encouraging that even if it's not in the same bill, there is support for the same concept. Ultimately, though, what's going to make that happen is not the bipartisan or lack of bipartisan support in the Congress, but rather what happened with the 9/11 Commission. And that too had been opposed at the time by the Republicans. It was opposed by the then Bush administration, which thought it would get too much of the blame for 9/11. What made that a force to be reckoned with, something that could not be denied, was the victims who came together and became a very potent force that demanded answers and demanded reforms to better protect the country in the future. They made that legislation happen. They made the commission operate in an effective, nonpartisan way. They made the Congress adopt the recommendations of the commission. And I fully suspect that that's what's going to happen here. It will take the victims of this virus, the brave, courageous healthcare workers who've been on the front lines of this, and many others to provide the critical mass necessary to insist on that kind of accountability.
I mean, I remember well how 9/11 widows and other survivors, other family members did bind together. And it was a sort of unique situation because in the people who were killed in the Trade Center and so forth, a lot of high finance types, whatever their relative power was. But the Wall Street community, the business community was engaged. And then you had the survivors of firefighters and police officers. And of course, there were victims in the Pentagon and on the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. But do you think, as we look across the landscape, do you think survivors who are Trump supporters, even if they lost family members, will take part in an effort towards accountability with people across a partisan and to some extent regional and racial and other divides?
I do think that, look, this virus is not going to discriminate on the basis of Trump supporters or Trump opponents. It's going to kill lots of both. And I think that anyone who's been victimized by this, and you're going to be hard pressed pretty soon to find a family that doesn't know someone that lost their life from this virus, they're going to want answers on behalf of their loved ones that transcend politics. Now, the commission legislation that I introduced wouldn't have the commission begin its work until early next year. Now, it's obviously my hope that early next year we have a completely different president. But I had the start date of this commission begin next year so that it wouldn't be a political issue in November. If you tried to do this kind of commission work now, pre-election, it might be nearly impossible. But I think when the election is behind us, when we have hopefully turned the corner on the worst of the virus, and we can begin to look with some objectivity, then I think that the time is right. And I think we'll have the critical mass necessary to do the work the way it really should be done. We should have epidemiologists and scientists and healthcare experts, experts in governance, a broad cross section of nonpartisan people participate in the work of this commission, and with the most important object being how do we protect the country in the future, because this will not be the last pandemic, but we can make it the last pandemic that is this costly to human life and to our economy.
So that is a deeper dive, further out form of accountability. What kind of accountability can Congress muster now under these circumstances? You and I were talking a little bit about the Intelligence Committee work is particularly challenging because of all the security protocols that aren't necessarily easily overcome. But the Oversight Committee, what can it do and frankly not do in the immediate future?
Well, there, I think, are two kinds of oversight going on in Congress that are going to be very important in real time. The commission is an after the fact review, but real time oversight is also vitally important. The select committee that we voted on and established last week will be a bipartisan select committee. It will be predominantly focused on the money, on the economic issues, on all the problems that we've seen identified in the small business program, for example, where you have very large businesses taking advantage of a program meant for small businesses, where you have small business customers of large banks going to the back of the line because the banks are playing favorites among their customers and rewarding the most lucrative. Those are obviously flaws in the implementation of this program. And so we need to have real-time oversight to make sure that money reaches those businesses it's intended for. Likewise, I'm hearing about from people in my district that there are stimulus checks going out to people who are deceased because it's on the basis simply of who filed a tax return last year, even though they may have subsequently passed. So it's very important in any number of respects to have real-time oversight of the money. Obviously, we're deeply concerned with this $500 billion fund for industry, given the president's predilection for rewarding friends and punishing enemies, and the fact that he fired the inspector general who was going to head the oversight panel overlooking those expenditures. One of the things that is a very much like character that only highlights the need for that kind of oversight by that select committee. As you may have seen within the last 2 weeks, there's an investigation going on of the awarding of a $10 billion contract for cloud computing to a competitor of Amazon. Amazon is rightly concerned that that contract went to a competitor when there was a lot of expectation that Amazon was the best position to get that contract, because the president wanted to punish Jeff Bezos, their CEO, who also is the publisher of the Washington Post. And we have seen the president intervene with the Postal Service to try to raise postal rates to punish Amazon, to punish Jeff Bezos, to punish the Washington Post. So this is, certainly consistent with the president's abuse of power. Those kind of issues need to be looked at, overseen in real time. There's a whole host of other issues, though: the lack of PPE, the lack of ventilators, the lack of testing, why there's no national testing strategy. And each of the congressional committees is doing oversight within areas of their jurisdiction. So in my committee, in the Intel Committee, we're looking at how is the IC, the Intelligence Community, postured to deal with this pandemic threat. What did they see? When did they see it? What were they reporting? What were they making of it? What did China know? What was China saying? How are other nations exploiting this? Russia in the last presidential election, in order to help Donald Trump, seized on different fissures in our society to try to manipulate public opinion. I have no doubt they will do exactly the same thing on the great cleavage of the 2020 election, which will be the pandemic. This cleavage we already see growing up between the protesters the president has been egging on about reopening, and others, particularly governors, who are saying that's dangerous for the people, the citizens of my state. So we're looking at that constellation of oversight issues in my committee. Each of the committees, though, will need to do real-time oversight in their areas of jurisdiction.
Forgive me for asking, but how can they do that right now when it's, you were just mentioning it was, you've been sort of told not to meet in at least larger groups, and there's no proxy vote provision yet. Are you able to hold hearings? Maybe not intelligence hearings, but is the committee that Jim Clyburn is heading up, will that be able to hold hearings virtually?
I think that it will. We're working out the capability of doing virtual hearings. I did a virtual briefing in the Intel Committee just this week. Now, we had called it a briefing because we're not authorized yet to do virtual hearings, but it was just like a virtual hearing in the sense that we had two top former Intel officials testify before the committee or brief the committee. We recognized the members in the video conference to ask questions. So it looked very much like a regular hearing, except done at a distance. Now, I won't sugarcoat it, though. It's very difficult at a distance to do meaningful oversight when you're dealing with bodies that don't particularly want to share the answers. The briefing we just had were people willing to come forward, willing to share their knowledge, and there's a lot that can be done very usefully that way, and a lot that can be done on the basis of unclassified information. But much of what we will need to know in the Intel Committee will be classified, and therefore we cannot do it at a distance. We certainly don't have the secure video capability among all of our members around the country right now to be able to conduct such a hearing. So we will need to come back and do it physically, and we'll figure out how to do that in a socially distanced and responsible way. In the meantime, though, we are doing the kind of oversight that we can by requiring information by teleconference, by using the budget where necessary to compel answers. One of the powers that Congress has is you don't answer my questions, okay, you don't get your budget. And so there are levers for us to get answers in writing, answers over the phone, answers by other means that we can go into the SCIF and review, even if we can't do it in person. Those limitations, many of them are less of an issue for other committees. So, for example, an oversight committee looking at the problem with protective gear. They did a bipartisan briefing where administration officials acknowledged that there were shortages of protective gear, that there were shortages of tests, that there are shortages in reagents, that there are shortages in swabs, basically refuted all the false happy talk that we get at these White House briefings from the president almost every day. So that's important oversight. Now it's less visible to the public, which is a problem, because a very important point of the oversight is getting good information out to the country. And when the president is propagating false information, when he's saying that there is abundant testing, that everyone can get tested when they can't, when he's saying that there's no problem with hospitals getting protective gear when they can't, that's an issue. When the president castigates the Inspector General of the Health and Human Services Agency for reporting back that hospitals around the country are telling her that they can't get the gear they need, it's important that the public be properly informed. So it's imperfect, to say the least. It's going to continue to get better as we find workarounds, and we're going to just have to identify a way to do it in person as soon as possible, because there's some elements of oversight we just can't do any other way.
Do you think that remote and or proxy voting will be coming down the pike soon. And frankly, when you think about it, it's kind of amazing that there wasn't a provision for this in the Cold War, or just because of travel time.
Yes. Well, first of all, yes, I do think we will be developing the capability to do remote voting. You're authorized, you authorize a particular member on a particular vote to vote in a particular way. So it won't be proxy voting in the sense of I'm going to give this person my proxy, they can vote however they want,
Right.
and they can carry around the proxies of a dozen people, but rather very specific, very limited. Then I think we will develop the capability for remote voting, depending on how long this persists. And I think that's going to be very important. And I think it's doable both constitutionally and technologically. We do have to look at some of the constitutional issues in that the Constitution requires that we have a quorum for certain work of the House, and the Constitution doesn't specify that you can
What
do
a
that
quorum
remotely.
means, right?
So, but I think that as one of the justices said so eloquently, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and it needs to be interpreted in a way to ensure the survivability of the republic. And if remote voting is necessary during a pandemic, I am confident nothing in the Constitution says otherwise. There, in terms of the Cold War, it may interest the audience, the viewers today, to know that there have been members for years working on a related issue, which is the survival of government issue. So if, for example, one of the planes on 9/11 had successfully hit the Capitol and killed a substantial number of members such that a quorum wasn't present of any kind,
Right.
virtually in person, whatnot, how do you continue government? A number of the members of Brian Baird of Washington State, a former member, he worked for that for years on that. The Congress, I think, probably to its discredit, never followed through with that. Perhaps didn't want to contemplate its own demise that way. But this is a new impetus for us to think and plan and put in place procedures for whatever exigency may face the nation.
I mean, Congress needs to watch more action adventure movies, I think, more espionage movies. There's a whole series of movies about just this.
As someone who literally represents Hollywood, I couldn't agree with you more.
Nicely done. One thing that came up when you talked to my colleague, David Corn, a week or so ago during the impeachment hearings was that you were shocked that it was quite obvious that when you started making your arguments to the Senate, that they hadn't watched the House hearings, and not just hadn't watched the full of them, but had seemed to have it all kind of mediated through Fox. Do you feel that that's going on with this crisis?
Well, I don't know that that's going on for the members of Congress through this crisis, because they're hearing from their constituents also. And so even if on Fox they continue to push out misinformation, they do get an earload, I'm sure, right now from their constituents who are worried about their health, who can't access loans through the small business program, who feel they're getting passed over by favored banking customers. So I think there is some ground truth that they're getting an earful of, and they should. But it was, I think, a refreshing surprise in some respects that the senators who initially, I think, may have been amazed that I didn't come into the Senate wearing horns because they only knew me through Fox, some of the Republican senators. It was encouraging that by the end of the trial, so many of them were acknowledging the truth, even if they couldn't bring themselves and muster the courage to convict the president. They were acknowledging publicly that he was guilty of what he was charged with. That was at least progress on the House, because House Republicans have become such a cult of the president that they're not even capable of acknowledging the facts staring them in the face. But we did have to operate from the premise, which turned out to be all too accurate, that the senators were really not watching the hearings in the House. They were getting the top line from Fox, which was completely misleading. And so you could see at times the astonishment
Mhm.
when we would put on the case and we would play testimony from the House hearings and we would show the documents, the almost surprise with just how powerful the case was. It was typified by something Lamar Alexander said towards the end of the trial when trying to justify the unjustifiable, and that is why he was voting not to hear from witnesses. His response was effectively, the House has already proved its case 15 ways. Do we really need them to prove it 16 ways? Those acknowledgments, at least of the truth, I think were an improvement on the kind of gaslighting going on within the administration from the president every day, from people like Devin Nunes and Jim Jordan and John Ratcliffe and others in the House. It was at least refreshing to hear any number of Republican senators acknowledge that, yes, truth is still truth. Facts still do matter, even if they don't have the courage to act on them.
Now, have you seen any conciliatory movement within the California delegation when it comes to the pandemic? I mean, you mentioned Kevin McCarthy earlier as extremely partisan. Devin Nunes is in the California delegation. Do the two of them and you and Barbara Lee and Maxine Waters ever come to any agreement about what needs to proceed in terms of representing the state of California?
Well, candidly, as long as I've known Kevin McCarthy, he has been the same, and that is a purely 100% political animal. And truth matters as little to him as it does to Donald Trump, and that's a great tragedy because he's the leader of their party in the House. Devin Nunes, on the other hand, he and I had a very good relationship in the pre-Trump era. We worked together very well. We produced Intel authorization bills every year. He was really a non-ideological John Boehner kind of a country club Republican. I think, though, that when the Midnight Run interlude blew up on him, when in the wake of James Comey's testimony very early in the Russia investigation, he got into an Uber in the middle of the night and went to an undisclosed location and said that he discovered classified information that he had to share with the White House and had a press conference about it. And it was revealed that he'd gotten that information actually from the White House. The place he'd gone to in the middle of the night was the White House. And he was forced to step down from being chair of the committee. I think that was such a catalytic experience for him, such a traumatic experience for him, that he decided that he was going to be all in with the president and has been ever since. And it's been really down the rabbit hole I think, an irretrievable fashion. But there remain good people within the GOP in Congress. I do think, though, that even the otherwise normal, rational members of the GOP, history will be very unkind to them because they lack the courage to stand up to this deeply unethical president when the country needed them to. And they'll have to answer for that. I will say it's been one of the biggest disappointments I've had of the Trump administration. And that is I had a much higher view of my Republican colleagues, of their commitment to their own ideals, of their commitment to the Constitution. They don't represent the Republican Party anymore. They represent the cult of personality of the president. So I do think when the president is gone, I have to hope that they will return to being Republican once again, and that we can find common ground. But in the meantime, we focus on what we can get done, even through the worst of the Russia investigation, the most difficult parts of the Ukraine investigation. The Intel Committee, on a bipartisan basis, year after year, produced our annual authorization bill, which set out all the budget, all the new privacy protections, all the civil liberties reforms. We came to agreement on that. That's a very controversial topic, and nonetheless, we got our work done. We'll continue to get our work done. even where there are these profound differences about what the president is doing to the country.
COVID, as we've all been made acutely aware, has taken every inequity in our society and magnified it and increased it. I'm wondering what you think are the most likely changes, perhaps even before a change of administration, if that happens, to occur that would help mitigate some of those. Do you think that there's a chance that some kind of sick leave could be a universal requirement? Is there a chance the Republicans would back off at least trying to take down Obamacare? What of any of these old fights, frankly, may have a chance of being viewed in a new way by both members of Congress and more conservative constituents?
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I think when we look at what this pandemic is revealing about American society, it is exposing in a whole new, graphic, undeniable, and deadly way just how many injustices, inequities, and disparities there are in our system of government, in our society at large, that need to be remedied. And there's an urgency right now. When you look at the mortality rate of African Americans from the COVID virus, it's just staggering, the death toll. And of course, there are a lot of reasons for this, having to do with access to healthcare. I have no doubt that when we do the postmortem on the financial recovery that minority institutions, businesses will have persistent difficulties in accessing capital through the small business program, and in the same way that there have been persistent difficulties with access to capital generally. So in every sphere of American life, this pandemic is making life more difficult, and indeed even ending life among those communities that are most at risk. And we have to look at this crisis through the prism of how do we build back better? How do we build back a country better than what we found when the pandemic hit? That addresses the lack of healthcare among so many, that addresses the lack of access to parental leave, lack of access to capital, any number of problems facing America, the yawning gap between rich and poor, the degree to which the wealth of the last quarter century has gone to a handful of families in the country, and just what poor economics that is, what poor morality that is. So I really do think that our horizon has to be broadened by this tragedy to build the country back better. One thing I will say about what we ought to do right now, and this is something I've been advocating for the last 2 months without success, but it's really starting to gain traction thanks to the work of one of my colleagues, Pramila Jayapal. And that is, a couple months ago in discussing the crisis with friends in Europe, I was struck at the approach that European countries were taking, that Britain and Germany and France and Norway and Sweden and Denmark, but also Asian countries like Singapore, where the government was guaranteeing payroll for businesses, large and small. That seemed to me much more equitable, much more efficient. You didn't need a separate program for small business and one for large industry. You didn't need to overwhelm unemployment compensation. You didn't need to have so many people unemployed. And when this virus does pass, then who have to now go and find employment because people got to retain the jobs they had, even if they couldn't perform the work right now. That kind of a payroll guarantee is, I think, the best approach. And
do you think it's via payroll, or is it a UBI, a universal basic income, kind of started up now? Let's become Alaska.
Those are two, I think, good models for us to explore. I've been particularly attracted to the payroll model because it has the effect of preserving employment.
Got it.
Preserving that connection. And they're not also mutually exclusive. the stimulus checks are a form of universal basic income if you made them monthly. Uh, and so, but I particularly think that the payroll guarantee is the right approach. Germany has maintained, with only a slight increase in unemployment, their pre-pandemic employment. America's made a choice to have millions and millions of its people, a huge percentage not seen since the Great Depression, now go on its unemployment rolls. That's not good for America. So I really think this is the right approach, and I'm going to continue to strongly advocate for it.
One of our listeners, I've been folding in other questions, but one wants to know, will Congress save the post office?
We have to save the post office. And this is also a very good question that has more than one aspect to it. First of all, millions of good middle-class jobs in the post office, including a lot of veterans who serve in the Postal Service. A lot of people during the pandemic completely reliant on the Postal Service for word from home, for medicine, for vital food and other supplies. So this is a terrible time to be talking about letting the Postal Service go under. But there are people using this pandemic for all kinds of policy objectives that they couldn't accomplish in other times. Some in the private world have always wanted to privatize the Postal Service, but only certain routes, only the
Right.
lucrative urban and suburban routes. They would more than happy to have the federal government handle the unprofitable rural routes and degrade service to rural customers. That doesn't make sense at all to me, except from a profit motive of certain segments of private industry or people in elective office who are beholden to those segments of private industry. But the opportunity to degrade the Postal Service or have the Postal Service fail also serves another GOP objective, and that is to disenfranchise people who vote by mail.
Right.
And one of the grave concerns I have about the November election, frankly, which eclipses the concern I have over another round of foreign interference, is the opportunity the pandemic gives those who have been already pushing voter disenfranchisement to take it to a completely new level. For years, it's been Mitch McConnell's business model, his political business model of disenfranchising voters, and Kevin McCarthy's as well. The more restrictive voter ID laws and the more polling places closed in urban centers, the more that could be done at the state level to limit the franchise, the better for them politically. That's been their whole calculus. And the president said the secret thing out loud, which is if more people vote, if more Americans vote, and more people eligible to vote actually vote, Republicans can't get elected. He literally said this, acknowledged this, admitted this. Well, that's a reason for them to change their incredibly divisive, xenophobic platform, their destructive platform. It's not a reason to disenfranchise voters. And I think it's vitally important that as we take up and debate new packages to deal with this pandemic, that we deal also with the health of our democracy. And we make ballots, postage paid ballots, available to every American citizen eligible to vote. And likewise, that we have polling stations open days or weeks before election day, that we make it easy and safe, that we not force people, as the Wisconsin GOP tried to do, to choose between their health and their vote.
Do you think election protection will be a part of the next stimulus bill? I mean, so far it seemed like, for better or for worse, they've wanted to really stick to just stimulus itself.
Absolutely. I think we have to insist that in the next legislation that we take up, we protect the health of the American people, we protect the health of our economy, and we protect the health of our democracy. So I think we need to fight to make sure that these provisions are part of the next big reform package that we take up. And that will no doubt make it a struggle. But I think the American people have a right not only to be able to vote, but to know where their elected officials stand on the franchise, whether they are willfully trying to obstruct people's ability to vote in this country. And so if the Republicans are determined to disenfranchise people, it ought to be abundantly clear what they're doing so that they can be held accountable at the polls. And it underscores, the central need to make sure that every American is able to vote in November, so that we don't see a repetition of so many of the ills we have seen over the last 4 years.
So my last question to you, and it's election related. If Vice President Biden picks Senator Kamala Harris to be his VP pick, will you toss your hat in the ring for the Senate seat?
Well, that will be up to the governor. If there's a vacancy in the Senate, the Governor Newsom will have the opportunity to appoint her successor. And I don't think this is really the time or place for me to express or not express interest in that. I appreciate the question, but at the moment, I'm going to worry about what's instantly on my plate, and there's a lot on that plate in terms of the oversight we talked about in Intel, as well as meeting the very basic needs of my constituents. So I have appreciated the speculation on that front over the last several months, but I think the vice president going to have a really difficult choice in picking running mate, because there are a number of excellent candidates, including Senator Harris.
Well,
Was that
Congressman,
a politic answer for you?
it was pretty politic. Well, maybe you're holding out for Attorney General?
Well, you're really not making this easy for me.
I mean, this is my job. Again, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Congressman Schiff, and to our audience for watching and participating live. Please support the Commonwealth Club that does this wonderful work, even when we're all stuck at home. And to watch more programs or support them, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Claire Jeffrey, editor of Mother Jones. Thank you to Congressman Schiff, and thank you to our viewers.
Thanks for having me.